Lord, prepare me to be a sanctuary, pure and holy, and tried and true. With thanksgiving, I'll be a living sanctuary for you. It is you, Lord, who came to save the heart and soul of every man. It is you, Lord, who knows my weakness, who gives me strength with thine own hand. Lord, prepare me to be a sanctuary, pure and holy, and tried and true. With thanksgiving, I'll be a living sanctuary for you. Lead me on, Lord, from temptation, and purify me from within. Fill my heart, Lord, with your Holy Spirit, and take away all my sin. Lord, prepare me to be a sanctuary, pure and holy.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Sermon Time with me, Pastor Tony, where today we are going to be looking at the subject, when it all comes down to worship. We're going to take a look today at a part of the book of Revelation where two nefarious characters are unleashing their influence on the world to get it to do something that violates the law of God, that gets people to break the Ten Commandments. These two powerful entities are identified as beasts in Revelation 13, one coming up out of the sea and the other coming up out of the land. And these two beasts are working together to motivate the world to worship someone other than God, to worship the beast that comes up out of the sea. What we're going to discover in our message today, covering Revelation chapters 13 and 14, is that when it comes to worship, there are two totally different sets of influencers using two very different sets of tactics to motivate people on the earth to worship. One coalition influences the worship of the beast, and the other influences the worship of God. And we're being foretold in this prophetic portion of the book what things are going to be like in the end of time, when it all comes down to worship. But before we get into the evidence for this, I would like to read a little passage from Barry Leash. He's a Christian scholar commenting on what the book of Revelation is all about at its core. This is what he says. Although the book of Revelation has been widely studied avidly as a book of prophecy, what it says about worship has been widely neglected. Yet at least 14 of the 22 chapters deal with worship. Worship is depicted as going on unceasingly before the throne. It is not an interlude between a sequence of dramatic scenes, as some have termed it. The reverse is true. In the deeper structure of the book, revelatory events themselves are the interludes that break up the practice of continuous worship before the throne of God. Moreover, worship in the last days becomes a strategic issue. The book unveils overall a cataclysmic conflict being waged across the expanse of heaven and earth as to who is to be worshipped. So, according to Leash, it's all about worship, who we worship, why we worship, what motivates our worship. In Revelation, you have two pulls on the human heart, seeking for worship. What is revealed here is how that worship is generated or motivated. The first set of verses coming from Revelation 13 show how the two beasts motivate the world to worship the sea beast. For example, in Revelation 13, verses 3 and 4, we read, "And I saw one of his heads as it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed. And all the world marveled and followed the beast. So they worshipped the dragon who gave authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, 'Who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him?'" So there are two forms of motivation being depicted here. One, they marveled or wondered after the beast. The word marvel here suggests that the beast could receive a deadly wound and heal itself and cause the world to wonder, how did he do that? How did he resurrect himself? It is truly a marvelous feat, no question about it. And by wowing the world with its miraculous abilities, the natural response from the world is astonishment and worship. The second motivation is hinted at in verse 4, where they worship the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, who is able to make war against him?" In the beast's show of authoritarian power, it produces a question in the hearts of the worshippers. Who is able to make war with him? We call this form of motivation intimidation, because there is a veiled threat that if you do not worship the beast, he will make war with you. So wonder and intimidation are motivating the worshipers in these two verses. In verses 7 and 8, we read something similar to this second motivation of intimidation. It was granted to him to make war with the saints and to overcome them, and authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. All who dwell on the earth will worship him whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb, slain from the foundation of the world. Here we have threats of violence and persecution for non-adherents, for people who choose not to worship this global authority we call the beast. So they wow the gullible and they threaten the resistant. Now we come to the second beast, the one that comes up out of the land or earth, as some versions read. Notice the difference between the motivations provided by the sea beast and the motivations now provided by the land beast. And it will become clear that the tactics used by the second beast are like the first beast's methods, but jacked up on steroids. Revelation 13:12, "And he exercises all the authority of the first beast in his presence and causes the earth and those who dwell in it to worship the first beast whose deadly wound was healed." All right, so here we are focusing in on a few phrases that highlight how it motivates worship. It says it exercises all the authority of the first beast. And it is using this authority of the state to cause the earth to worship the beast. The word cause here implies force, coercion. This motivation is external, forced upon an earth from the outside. Notice in the verses before, the use of force was leveled against those who refused to worship the beast. But here, the force is applied to everyone on the earth. Force seems to get to what we want faster. But one thing it can never do is win a heart. You can obtain compliance by force, but not love. The only way to get our heart is if we choose to give it away. So, land beast uses force, causes the earth to worship. Now let's peek at verses 13 and 14. "He performs great signs so that he even makes fire come down from heaven on the earth in the sight of men. And he deceives those who dwell on the earth by those signs which he was granted to do in the sight of the beast, telling those who dwell on the earth to make an image to the beast who was wounded by the sword and lived." So what's going on here? Here you have the employment of deceptive miracles. They're trying to motivate the world to worship the beast by deceiving them into it. The land beast is able to perform actual miracles to persuade the hesitant masses to join their movement. Look at us. We can make fire come down out of heaven like Elijah did on Mount Carmel, when he proved he was the true prophet and his God was the true God. Except one problem. When the land beast does this miracle, it doesn't prove anything. It doesn't prove what Elijah proved. The miracle is deceptive. Deception can be very motivating. It seems in our current political and social climates that misinformation and disinformation are more alluring to the masses than the truth. Many don't want to hear the truth. They like the lie. They prefer the lie. Now we are not condemned for believing a lie. The liar is condemned for telling the lie. We are condemned in the end for not believing the truth. And with so much misinformation to sort through, many will never come to believe the truth. So in addition to the sea beast's methods of marvel and might, here we see a new one: misdirection. This brings us to verse 15, where you have the threat of annihilation. He was granted power to give breath to the image of the beast, that the image of the beast should both speak and cause as many as would not worship the image of the beast to be killed. So the land beast doesn't just coerce or intimidate or deceive non-compliant people. It's prepared to kill them. And this brings us to our last verse in this handling of inappropriate forms of motivation for worship, verses 16 and 17. He causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. What we have here is a threat of deprivation. For many, this could be worse than the threat of annihilation because it involves torture, right? It's slower, discriminatory against basic and universally recognized human rights. Also, what you have here is mob mentality, right? No mark like we have, no food like we get, no housing, no jobs, no access to goods and services, no transportation or medical care and whatnot. You are excluded from the privileges the masses enjoy because they worship the beast and you don't. The threat of deprivation will convince many, motivate many to fall into line with this false system of worship. So we have force and coercion, deception and deprivation, all tactics of the enemy. That's the way it is with the beasts of Revelation 13 and how they motivate the worship of the beasts. Now we prepare for a seismic shift as we look into Revelation chapter 14 and a massive difference as to what motivates the worship of God. In Revelation 14:1, for example, we have listed the first motivation when John looked and saw the 144,000 having his Father's name written on their foreheads. We discovered in a previous message that what this symbol of the name in the forehead represents is that they have the Father's character reproduced in their hearts. And we noted that it was written there. God put it there himself. God transformed their heart to be like his in character. And it is this transformation of character that motivates the worship in the two verses that follow. God transformed them, and this inspired their worship. Revelation 14:3. They sang as it were a new song before the throne, before the four living creatures and the elders, and no one could learn that song except the 144,000 who were redeemed from the earth. Here's another form of motivation for worshiping God. What motivates them to worship is the fact of their accomplished redemption. They have been bought with a price, the price of God's Son's own life for theirs. Nothing can compare to knowing how much he loves us when even to die for us on the cross, that we might have a shot at the life he has always wanted us to live. Not just life in heaven, but a life like his. That is redemption, and that will motivate our worship of God throughout the ceaseless ages of eternity. Verse 4, they follow the Lamb wherever he goes. They willingly follow this Lamb. A lamb. Not a threatening, violent, murderous, deceptive beast, but a lamb. Innocent, pure, undefiled. They elect this worship. They choose this worship freely. Verse 5 claims, and in their mouth was found no deceit, for they are without fault before the throne of God. No deceit and without fault before the throne, huh? They were not always this way. No one is always this way, except Jesus, of course. They were not always this perfect, but they began the same way we did, flawed, messed up, sinful, with a shady past. In order to get blameless, two things had to happen. One, all the messed up past they had, it had to be removed from their record. The whole past erased, cleaned up, eradicated. And two, the second thing is they had to have his character. We call this a radical transformation. When a person who was once a sinner becomes a child of God. That is as transformative as a lowly worm becoming a butterfly. In fact, the Bible calls our transformation a metamorphosis and a complete do-over. We now look at the motivating factors in Revelation 14, verses 6 and 7. Then I saw an angel flying in the midst of heaven, having the everlasting gospel to preach to those who dwell on the earth, to every nation, tribe, tongue, and people, saying with a loud voice, Fear God, give glory to him, for the hour of his judgment has come, and worship him who made heaven and earth, the sea, and the springs of water. So we have messengers here going out into the entire world to motivate them to worship God. What do these messengers have in their toolbox to motivate the masses? Their words, a message, persuasive speech, credible, believable information, an awakening to the truth of their salvation in Christ. We call this the gospel, the good news. And it isn't forced upon anybody. It is spoken loudly, mind you, and clearly in a language and in terms the receiving audience can understand. But there are no manipulative methods employed here. They have the truth on their side, so they don't have to deceive. They have all power on their side, so they don't have to threaten. They are not seeking compliance, but a surrender of the heart and life to God, which will only happen when they learn of the truth about God. And like the opening of a bud to a warming sun, they open themselves to the warmth of God's love. One more passage on the motivational efforts of God in Revelation. And we'll find this in Revelation 14, verses 8 to 11. And another angel followed, saying, Babylon is fallen, that great city, because she has made all nations drink of the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Then a third angel followed them, saying with a loud voice, If anyone worships the beast in his image and receives his mark on his forehead or on his hand, he himself shall also drink of the wine of the wrath of God, which is poured out full strength into the cup of his indignation. He shall be tormented with fire and brimstone in the presence of the holy angels and in the presence of the Lamb. And the smoke of their torment ascends forever and ever, and they have no rest day or night who worship the beast and his image, and whoever receives the mark of his name. Two separate messages here, the second angel and the third angel, but they are both warning messages. One, Babylon is fallen, come out of her, my people. And two, those who worship the beast and his image and receive his mark will experience the judgment of God. We need to keep in mind the purpose behind these messages is to avert the impending doom. Some people, atheists for example, claim here that God is threatening people, and who would want to worship freely, choose freely to worship a threatening God? If you don't accept me, I'm going to kill you. That's how they depict these verses. Well, that's one perspective. But I would like to suggest a completely different way of looking at this. It's kind of like a military general who has orders to attack a country. But before the attack is executed, he calls up the enemy and tells them, we are going to attack your country on such and such a day, at such and such a time, at such and such a location, with a certain number of weapons and troops for this and that reason. And we are telling you this ahead of time so that you can avert the disaster coming upon you and avoid the whole ordeal. That message is a warning. It's a merciful opportunity, not a threat. It's foretelling what is going to happen to the human race at the end of time so that they can weigh all their options and choose accordingly. They're given a choice to decide which side they're going to be on. The earth is not being judged for doing everything right, but for doing everything but what is right. And right now we have this opportunity to get it right. The opposite of worshiping with Babylon and the opposite of not worshiping the beast is to keep the commandments of God. The two sides are clearly demarcated in the third angel's message because right after our verse here at the end of the message about the mark of the beast is Revelation 14:12, where God reveals the contrasting group. Here is the patience of the saints. Here are those who keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus. The opposite of worshiping the beast and receiving the mark of the beast is keeping the commandments of God. You and I can choose which side we're going to be on. We can decide who we're going to worship, though I hardly see the alternative to God as a viable option for me, seeing they have to coerce and deceive and manipulate people into choosing their side and worshiping their God. But nonetheless, there are two sides, and it comes down to either worshiping the beast by not keeping the commandments of God or worshiping God by keeping the commandments of God. Now, I'm going to conclude this message by taking us out of the book of Revelation because no one I know has delineated between these two options better than Jesus. So I'm reading now from Mark chapter 7, verses 6 to 8. Jesus answered and said to them, well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. And in vain they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. For laying aside the commandment of God, you hold the tradition of men. Jesus calls choosing the alternative form of worship, that form that places the traditions of men over the commandments of God, vain, which means worthless. Any attempt to serve God apart from keeping his commandments is a form of worship the Lord himself deems worthless. To him, it's meaningless. To him, it's valueless. It's empty to him, completely devoid of merit. He is calling his people, you and me, out of Babylon's confusion, out of self-made righteousness and man-made traditions, and into his great salvation, where he works on our behalf and works deep inside us to write his law, his name, his character, his way into us. Day by day, decision by decision, moment by moment. That is the good news. And we can have it if we desire. Even so, come, Lord Jesus, and God bless you all.